How do we truly define ourselves? Is it primarily by where we live, the heritage of our ancestors, or is there something much broader at play?
It's a fundamental question, isn't it?
It really is. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into this fascinating, intricate, and sometimes, well, volatile relationship between geopolitics and identity. We're drawing heavily from the insightful work of Klaus Stotz, exploring how identity both shapes and is shaped by global power dynamics, territorial claims, and even the nuances of our everyday lives.
Yeah, Dodds really gets into the nitty-gritty of it.
Exactly. So our mission today is to dissect how these identities, national, regional, even subnational, are carefully constructed, often fiercely contested, and how these powerful narratives directly influence global events,
Right.
from major international conflicts right down to the headlines you read every morning. We'll try and uncover some truly surprising ways these dynamics manifest.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how often we treat identity as just a given, like it's an innate characteristic.
Yeah, we just assume it.
But it is profoundly, fundamentally geographical. It extends far beyond just, flags and borders. It's deeply rooted in the powerful stories we collectively tell ourselves about who we are and consequently who they are.
That us and them dynamic.
Precisely. And think about, consider for a moment the profound emotional and geographical connection that was forged right after the tragic 9/11 attacks in the U.S.
Okay.
Just one day later, September 12, 2001, the big French newspaper Le Monde published this headline that just jumped across national boundaries. Nous sommes tous Américains. We are all Americans now.
I remember that. It felt huge.
It was huge, and it wasn't just a fleeting sentiment or some polite diplomatic gesture. It was this extraordinary declaration of immediate global solidarity, a spontaneous formation of a collective identity that, for a moment, ignored traditional borders. It highlighted how rapidly and powerfully such connections can form on global, national, and local scales.
That initial global solidarity, that incredibly powerful, we are all Americans now, it really did feel like a profound moment. But as you suggest, it didn't take long for that feeling to shift, did it? It seemed to almost immediately renationalize the tragedy. What happened there? And what was the lasting impact on how the U.S. was seen?
Yeah, it's an astute observation. That initial wave of global empathy very, very quickly reinscribed the events of 9/11 in overwhelmingly national terms.
How so?
Well, the prevailing narrative swiftly became attack on America. It framed the tragedy specifically as an assault on the United States and its people rather than, say, a broader attack on humanity or global values.
Right, focusing inward.
Exactly. And tragically, as figures like former Vice President Al Gore have keenly observed, the United States in many ways squandered that immense global goodwill and solidarity.
Squandered it. How?
Well, this dissipation was largely due to a series of foreign policy actions and decisions that were widely perceived internationally as, well, let's say inimical to, or even in violation of international law.
Okay, like what specifically?
You saw the unilateral engagement in Iraq, which lacked broad international consensus or UN Security Council backing.
Right, that was hugely controversial.
Hugely. Then there was the practice of extraordinary rendition, essentially, government-sanctioned transfer of people outside legal processes, often for interrogation in places with questionable human rights records. Add to that the establishment of detention camps like Guantanamo Bay and the formal adoption of the doctrine of preemption, asserting the right to launch preventive military action.
Okay, so a whole series of
A
actions.
whole series. And as a direct consequence for many across the globe, that initial feeling of we're all Americans now just evaporated.
It really did fade quickly.
It was replaced by far more critical viewpoints. You had a torrent of books, articles, online discussions condemning the Bush administration and the United States. The nation, once seen primarily as a victim, started being associated with labels like Empire of Evil or Rogue State. It was a profound shift in its global image.
Wow, Empire of Evil. That's strong.
It really highlights this critical concept. National reputation and image management are paramount, even for a nation as powerful as the U.S.
It's not just PR then.
Not at all. The Dutch political scientist Peter van Ham articulated this really well. He described it as a move from the modern world of geopolitics and power to the postmodern world of images and influence.
Images and influence.
Exactly. The crucial takeaway here is that in today's interconnected world, a nation's image isn't superficial, it's a tangible asset. It's soft power. Van Ham argued that reputation becomes essential strategic equity for states.
Strategic equity meaning?
Meaning, basically, having a poor reputation, or even no distinct reputation, becomes a serious handicap if you want to stay competitive and influential internationally. So managing that image isn't just about looking good, it's fundamental strategic state power in the modern world.
That's a powerful point about national reputation becoming a form of strategic equity. It makes you wonder then, how does a nation even begin to construct its sense of self? It's clearly not just about these grand gestures or major international policies. You're suggesting identity is also shaped by much more subtle, maybe even unconscious processes, what we call banal forms of nationalism.
Precisely. The sociologist Michael Billig's groundbreaking work on everyday nationalism illuminates this perfectly. Our daily lives are absolutely replete with practices, symbols, linguistic cues that constantly, almost imperceptibly, reinforce national identities and their associated territories.
Like what kind of things?
Well, think about something as simple as the flag you see flying on a public building every day.
Okay, yeah.
Or the currency in your pocket, the way news broadcasts are framed as national news, or even just referring to your country affectionately as the fatherland or homeland. These seemingly minor, often unnoticed elements are incredibly powerful tools.
Right, they're just part of the background noise.
They are, but governments actively mobilize both time and space to secure and cement these national identities. National territories are meticulously mapped and celebrated. Specific dates are cherished as national birthdays like July 4th for the United States. Certain landscapes and historical sites become sacred or emblematic of a nation's heritage, invested with deep emotional and symbolic meaning. Think about Ground Zero in New York after 9/11.
Okay.
It rapidly joined established symbols like the Statue of Liberty as potent physical and imaginative representations of the United States. They embody its self-understanding as this beacon of liberty and democracy, linking past ideals with present challenges.
But you're saying we need to look closer at those claims.
Absolutely. It's crucial to scrutinize these claims to national identity because they are rarely universally shared. The United States, for example, founded as this revolutionary state championing self-determination, played a huge role post-1945 and promoted liberal democracy during the Cold War. Yet, simultaneously, within its own borders, African Americans were engaged in a profound, often violent, struggle to secure their fundamental civil rights and achieve full participation in that very democracy.
A huge internal contradiction.
A massive one. Geographically, they were often systematically excluded, denied voting opportunities, faced systemic discrimination. It raises that important question. When we discuss a national identity, we always have to ask, who is included in that narrative? And maybe more importantly, who is excluded?
So it's often more contested than elites want us to believe.
Exactly. A truly shared sense of history and geography is often far more problematic. Billig's real insight is how deeply ingrained and often unnoticed our national identity is, built not just on grand declarations, but on the seemingly trivial everyday details.
That's a profound observation about the contested nature of national identity. It makes me wonder, when we look at a country whose very territory has been a site of deep contestation and loss, how does that, magnify this idea of constructed identity? Argentina seems like a striking example of what it means to be a geographically violated country. Tell us how that narrative has played out in its history.
Argentina is indeed a powerful case study for understanding how national identities are not just discovered, but are very much invented.
Indented, okay.
And they are always inherently geographical, tied inextricably to particular places. Benedict Anderson's famous concept of the imagined community is really central here.
Imagined community, how does that apply?
Well, in Argentina, which declared independence from Spain way back in 1810, the survival and cohesion of the new nation state were seen as intrinsically linked to creating a unified national consciousness among its diverse population.
So they had to build that sense of Argentineness.
Exactly. And one key way was through patriotic education, introduced in the late 19th century.
Why then specifically?
The timing was highly strategic. The Argentine government had recently expanded its authority over a much larger territory, including Patagonia, and it was dealing with huge waves of new immigrants, mainly from Italy and Spain.
So they needed to integrate these newcomers.
Precisely. They needed to be incorporated into the national fabric, instilled with a strong sense of what it meant to be an Argentine citizen, to foster a shared identity in a rapidly changing nation.
And this was happening while borders were still being fought over elsewhere.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In the broader South American context, territorial boundaries were incredibly sensitive, often volatile. Countries like Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, they frequently negotiated and sometimes engaged in brutal conflicts over their national territories.
Right.
Argentina, in many respects, was a territorial success story compared to some neighbors expanding southwest and north. Paraguay, for instance, suffered catastrophically in the War of the Triple Alliance in the 1860s, lost huge territory, maybe over half its adult male population.
Devastating.
And landlocked Bolivia lost its crucial Pacific corridor in the War of the Pacific. These aren't just historical footnotes. They forged national identities, leaving deep, painful scars that still influence perceptions today.
So Argentina did well territorially, but there was one major exception.
Yes. Despite its expansions, one specific event in the 19th century would dramatically and profoundly impact its national identity. The loss of the Islas Malvinas, or the Falkland Islands, to the British in 1833.
That's a really stark contrast. So this loss of the Malvinas wasn't just a historical event. It sounds like it became deeply embedded in the national psyche, almost an ongoing indoctrination that shaped an entire nation's identity. How far did this territorial grievance go, and what were the socio-political consequences?
It absolutely became a central, enduring narrative. The loss of the Malvinas was rapidly elevated to one of the most important elements of that patriotic education we mentioned.
So it was taught in schools.
Explicitly. Generations were taught that Argentina was an incomplete country, a nation whose very geographical body was mutilated. The islands themselves were later described in deeply emotional, almost familial, and even gendered terms, the Lost Little Sisters, a cherished appendage of the continental fatherland.
Wow, lost little sisters. That's powerful framing.
Incredibly powerful, and it continues to be actively promoted through the education system. Every young child is taught to meticulously draw an outline of the islands and label them as Argentine.
So it's deeply ingrained from a young age.
Deeply. It's not surprising, then, that when Argentine forces invaded the Falklands in 1982, the action was widely vindicated by much of the Argentine public as an act of geographical salvation.
Geographical salvation.
A righteous reclaiming after an earlier rape by what they termed perfidious Albion, that old nationalistic dig at Britain.
And the public supported this, even with the military regime in power.
Even more remarkably, and quite chillingly for outsiders, massive crowds gathered in Buenos Aires' main square to cheer the military regime at that moment. This was happening even while the same government was engaged in horrific practices, systematic torture, and execution of its own citizens.
It's hard to fathom.
It shows how complete the geographical indoctrination was, how profound the emotional investment in the Malvinas. Many were willing to overlook domestic atrocities to celebrate this act of territorial annexation.
And the feeling persists even after the British victory.
Oh, absolutely. Despite the decisive British win in June 1982, this territorial crisis persists in the Argentine imagination. Citizens are constantly informed through various channels that the grievance remains outstanding.
How is it kept alive?
I vividly recall visiting Argentina on the 10th anniversary of the conflict. While the British largely commemorated it as something past, Argentine media and government actively encouraged citizens to imagine the dispute as ongoing. Weather reports and newspapers consistently labeled the Falklands as the Malvinas, undeniably Argentine.
So it's constantly reinforced.
Yeah, constantly. Since the late 1940s, it's actually been an official offense in Argentina to produce any map that doesn't label the Falklands as Argentine and also include a chunk of Antarctica. Public maps, murals, and towns, they constantly remind people the islands are close to Patagonia, condemning British sovereignty as lingering imperialism.
Even war monuments play a role.
Yes. The public war monuments erected since '82 serve not just as memorials, but as opportunities for ongoing geographical and cultural reflection on what should be Argentine territory, in their view.
It really illustrates that point about identity needing difference.
Perfectly. It brings to mind William Connolly's observation. Identity requires difference in order to be, and it converts difference into otherness in order to secure its own self-certainty.
Meaning us is defined by not them.
Essentially, yes. Our sense of self gets reinforced when we highlight differences, sometimes turning it into a clear us versus them. In Argentina's case, British imperialism and American power often serve as that other, against which Argentine identity is forged.
And challenging that is dangerous.
Extremely. The intensity is captured by the anecdote of Carlos Escudé, the political scientist who got death threats for critically analyzing this territorial nationalism. He even wore a badge saying Falklands were British in the foreign ministry, an incredibly courageous act given the pervasive national belief.
That's incredibly powerful, the depth of emotion tied to that territorial claim. It's clear that for Argentina, national identity is inextricably tied to land. But you've also mentioned that not all national identities are rooted in this same kind of territorial obsession. For countries like the United States, it sounds like the focus shifts from physical borders to something else entirely. What does this all mean for how different nations forge their sense of self beyond the land itself?
That's an excellent distinction, and it really highlights the diverse ways national identity can be constructed. While Argentina's identity has been profoundly shaped by its territory and this sense of geographical violation, countries like the U.S., with very little direct experience of losing territory on its mainland.
Right, it's mostly expanded.
Exactly. They have expressed national identity formation in a fundamentally different way. If Argentines worried about physical borders and lost land, Americans have largely been preoccupied with the social and racial character of their national community.
Social and racial character, meaning?
Meaning the experiences of Native American, Japanese American, African American communities stand in stark contrast to those of, say, white Protestant Americans who historically shaped the dominant political and cultural norms. The U.S. political geography has been profoundly shaped by these internal struggles for minority communities to be fully recognized and integrated.
Like a civil rights movement.
Precisely. Think about the immense struggles of the civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s. This deeply internal battle unfolded against the geopolitical backdrop of the Cold War.
Right, while the U.S. was promoting freedom abroad.
Exactly. While figures like Rosa Parks were struggling for basic rights like a bus seat, the Eisenhower administration was in this titanic global struggle with the Soviet Union for hearts and minds. If America consistently defined itself by championing liberty abroad, many African Americans must have felt the tragic irony of communities within the U.S. being systematically disenfranchised, degraded.
A huge disconnect.
A huge disconnect. Even powerful symbols like the Statue of Liberty could be interpreted very differently depending on a community's lived experience. After Hurricane Katrina, for example, many African-American families, disproportionately poor and immobile, drew sharp connections when it seemed the federal government was slow to react to their catastrophic losses, highlighting a perceived racial disparity.
And this internal focus continues today.
It absolutely continues into the post-9/11 context. We've seen the apparently ambivalent role occupied by Arab American and Asian American communities. Many reported widespread harassment, intimidation, being ejected from flights, denied service simply based on appearance or language like Arabic or Urdu. The Council of Arab American Relations has vocally complained about their community feeling victimized and stigmatized because of the actions of the 9/11 hijackers.
So the war on terror created new internal identity issues.
It's been suggested it inadvertently created new forms of identity politics that prioritize certain expressions of identity, gender, race, sexuality, often at the expense of ethnic minorities. These groups are now frequently viewed with suspicion, fear, even loathing, especially in public spaces.
And this shows up in culture, too.
Yeah, even in popular culture. You see comic book heroes like Captain America now battling Islamic terrorists depicted as assaulting Christian American values in imaginary American towns. It subtly reinforces an us versus them narrative tied to specific internal cultural identities. It vividly shows how these internal identity struggles are constantly in play, shaping and sometimes straining national identity.
That's a powerful illustration of how identity can be defined not just by what you have, but by who you include or exclude. But now, let's zoom out a bit and consider how identities can extend beyond existing national borders. The European Union, in particular, offers a fascinating example because it represents this deliberate, ambitious effort to transcend traditional territorial boundaries and forge a pan-regional identity.
Indeed. Identities, as we've seen, aren't static. They can be deliberately produced and engineered to transcend existing states. The EU project is a prime, incredibly ambitious example.
Born out of conflict, right?
Exactly. Born from the ashes of two devastating world wars with this deep-seated desire to prevent future conflicts on the continent. Visionaries like Jean Monnet, Konrad Adenauer, they were instrumental in initiating this profound process towards European cooperation and integration, starting with the 1957 Treaty of Rome.
And for countries like West Germany, it was more than just economics.
Oh, much more. For West Germany, still recovering from war and partition, joining wasn't just about economic benefits. It was a fundamental way to reimagine itself as part of a democratic Europe, a crucial geostrategic ally of the U.S., anchoring it to a new, peaceful identity.
But defining Europe itself has been tricky.
Incredibly tricky. Defining Europe's geographical and cultural boundaries has been an ongoing, complex challenge. Who precisely could join this evolving economic club? Where did Europe truly begin and end, physically and culturally? Did countries have to be predominantly Christian?
That brings up the issue of Turkey.
Exactly. Turkey's long-standing application, first submitted way back in 1963, really highlights this complexity. Its potential entry remains mired in controversy.
What are the main concerns?
Well, some existing members, like Austria, voice concerns about the potential economic, political, cultural strains a populist Turkey might place on the EU. Others point to Turkey's patchy record on human rights and minority protections.
But there's something deeper, too.
Often, yes. Beneath these practical concerns, there's often a fundamental cultural anxiety about integrating additional Muslim populations into a Europe that already has substantial and sometimes marginalized Muslim communities.
So it touches on the core definition of European.
Precisely. This is where the cultural and religious debates become really intricate. It's distinct from, say, Kemalism, the secular, Western-oriented ideology of modern Turkey versus the current AK Party's vision of an Islamic-leaning democracy, which some fear could challenge European self-definitions.
That's a critical point about the anxiety surrounding Turkey's application. It raises an even broader question. What happens when that ambitious pan-regional identity is truly tested, from within and without? It seems Europe has faced some profound challenges that have exposed the very complexities and vulnerabilities of its evolving identity.
Absolutely. The Bosnian Wars in the early 1990s were a truly damning indictment of the European project's foundational aspirations and its capacity for collective action.
Why damning?
Well, despite the close geographical proximity, EU states were widely and fiercely criticized for their weakness. Their inability to effectively intervene as cities like Mostar and Sarajevo were systematically destroyed, and the horrific Srebrenica massacre occurred.
So close, yet they couldn't act effectively.
Right. Many intellectuals, Bosnian and European, poured scorn on the failure of fellow Europeans to come to the aid of this multicultural country just a short flight away. It was seen as a profound failure of the European project to uphold its professed values: integration, tolerance, peace, democracy. It raised serious questions about its moral authority.
And internally, there were debates, too, like with the Constitution.
Yes, during the negotiations for a European constitution, a significant contentious debate emerged. Political figures, particularly on the right, strongly wanted the Constitution to embody a Christian European ethos, emphasizing its identity as a distinct civilization rooted in Christian heritage.
But that didn't fly.
No, that proposed constitution was later rejected by French and Dutch voters, derailing that specific text and signaling public discomfort with such an overtly religious definition. For non-Christian communities across the continent, Jewish, Muslim, this notion of Europe being primarily Christian was deeply alarming.
Because it excluded them.
Exactly. It highlights the tension between a secular ideal of Europe and a more narrowly culturally or religiously defined one.
And then there are the challenges involving Muslim communities within Europe.
Yes. The ongoing alienation faced by Muslim communities in Europe poses another significant and escalating internal challenge. You had Muhammad Atta's deep disillusionment while studying in Germany, which some suggest contributed to his radicalization.
Right.
The widespread Paris riots in 2005 were blamed partly on systemic discrimination faced by young Muslim men in the suburbs. This potent mix of local grievances, coupled with global crises in Afghanistan, Palestine, Iraq, Chechnya, contributed to a sense of grievance and marginalization among some Muslim youth.
Connecting local issues to global ones.
Critically, this confluence was cited as significant in motivating the men who bombed the London transport system on July 7, 2005, showing the dangerous links between internal alienation and global events.
And this feeds into anxieties about migration, too.
It does. These intense cultural debates fuel anxieties about the flow of people, both internally within the EU as new members join, and from outside. When Poland and Slovakia joined in 2004, some British newspapers issued alarmist warnings about Britain being swamped by Eastern Europeans.
That not like us rhetoric.
Exactly. Just like earlier immigration from the Commonwealth, phrases like not like us often function as a cultural geographical code, seemingly innocuous, but actually cloaking much deeper national and pan-regional identity, worries about cultural dilution and economic strain. It shows how even within a project designed for integration, the fundamental questions of who belongs remain potent and contested.
That's a fascinating look at the internal and external pressures on Europe's identity. But if the EU represents an effort to create a new, broader identity, what does this all mean for individual countries trying to find their place or even redefine themselves on the global stage? It seems the EU plays a surprising dual role, not just in forming a larger European identity, but also in actively promoting new national identities and engaging globally.
It truly is a fascinating paradox of integration. While the EU aims for greater cohesion, it has also, perhaps inadvertently, actively encouraged new expressions of national identity.
How so? Give us an example.
A compelling example is Montenegro's 2006 referendum for independence from Serbia. The key driver wasn't solely a long-standing desire for national independence itself.
What was it then?
It was an overwhelming and strategic desire to join the European Union. The EU played an unprecedented direct role, explicitly setting the criteria Montenegro needed to meet for its independence to be recognized.
So the EU effectively enabled its creation.
In a way, yes. Many Montenegrins were deeply unhappy. Their EU aspirations were suspended because of Serbia's issues with war criminals. This shows how a pan-European organization can directly shape cultural claims to a European identity by influencing, even enabling, national political decisions leading to a new state.
Interesting. And it helped redefine other countries too.
Definitely. For Baltic countries like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, who'd been under Soviet influence for decades, EU membership was transformative. It allowed them to powerfully reimagine themselves as European and distance themselves from their fraught history with the former Soviet Union.
A way to break from the past.
Exactly. And the EU even stepped in to safeguard the rights of their Russian-speaking minorities, somewhat paradoxically, Europe intervening for the salvation of a Russian minority, ensuring national laws weren't overly exclusionary.
So there are competing visions within Europe itself.
Oh, absolutely. You have competing geopolitical visions, some advocating for Europe of nations, emphasizing sovereignty, others pushing for a more centralized United States of Europe.
How do they manage that tension?
Often geographically, through practical agreements and different levels of integration. Think of the Eurozone, not all members use the euro. Or the Schengen Agreement, eliminating border controls, again, not universal.
And the EU acts globally too.
Increasingly so. Its global role is expanding significantly. In 2006, it approved that large UNIFIL force of over 7,000 mainly European troops to southern Lebanon, showing willingness to act beyond its borders. It consistently contributes to humanitarian missions worldwide, Congo, East Timor, Moldova.
So it's shaping its identity through action.
Precisely. This outward engagement further solidifies how a pan-European organization can play a decisive role in shaping cultural claims to a European identity, not just internally, but on the world stage.
We've talked about national identities and then pan-regional identities like the EU. Now let's drill down even further. It's fascinating how identity can be contested even within national borders, leading to what we call subnational identity politics. How do these smaller groupings challenge central authority, and what are the implications?
This brings us to a crucial point, where that assumption of neat, territorially bounded national identities gets really complicated.
Because not all countries are homogenous.
Exactly. While places like Japan or Iceland have less direct experience with this, many states constantly grapple with internal dynamics. Within Europe, vibrant communities like the Catalans in Spain or the Walloons in Belgium continuously remind us that national unity is often circumscribed, deeply contested, sometimes even violently challenged.
So nation building isn't a finished job.
Rarely. It's a dynamic, ongoing process. States like Spain have historically alternated between outright repression and attempts at accommodation of these competing demands for autonomy and unique identity within their borders. Madrid, for instance, has granted more autonomy to Catalan and Basque communities over the last 40 years, education, policing, even as military officials publicly state they'll never be allowed to break away.
And this determination can provoke extremism, like ETA.
Sometimes, yes. This unwavering determination to maintain territorial integrity has sometimes provoked extremist groups like ET Basque, Homeland, and Freedom to pursue terror campaigns, bombings, assassinations, both in the Basque region and cities like Madrid.
What were they fighting for?
ETA, formed back in 1959, aimed to promote Basque nationalism and an anti-colonial message against what they saw as Spain's occupation. Franco tried to crush them unsuccessfully. They continued after his death.
And they were blamed for the Madrid train bombings.
Initially, yes, the March 11, 2004 bombings, which tragically killed nearly 200 people. The government at the time, which had controversially supported the war on terror in Iraq, was heavily defeated in the election just days later.
But it wasn't ETA.
No, it was later determined to be Islamic militant groups. But the government, perhaps facing low popularity, opportunistically tried to blame an internal organization for an attack widely seen as blowback for Spain's foreign policy. It really highlights the political opportunism around identity and security.
How do these groups build their own narratives?
Separatist groups, whether ETA or others in Catalonia and Galicia, actively mobilize powerful counter-narratives. They might target symbols of the Spanish state or vigorously promote their difference through distinct languages, regional flags, and alternative maps like ETA's Euskal Herria map showing a larger Basque homeland across Spain and France.
Even football plays a role.
Oh, absolutely. Football rivalries in Spain are a very real expression of popular geopolitics. Matches between Basque or Catalan teams like Athletic Bilbao and Barcelona against Real Madrid, notoriously supported by Franco as a symbol of Spanish unity, are incredibly intense.
So the stadium becomes a political arena.
In many ways, yes. These matches become a proxy for regional identity against central authority. Franco even tried to use Real Madrid's success to suppress regional differences, banning the Catalan language during his rule. It shows the deep link between cultural suppression and national control.
That's a fascinating look at the interplay of subnational identity and state power, even extending into sports. But this isn't just a European phenomenon, is it? These dynamics of subnational groups challenging central authority and how states label them really play out on a global scale.
Absolutely. Take China, for example. The authorities in Beijing have explicitly identified separatist movements in Western China, Tibet, and especially Muslim separatists, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, as a major security threat, particularly post 9/11.
Why the focus there?
Since 1949, the Chinese Communist Party has been deeply anxious about territorial integrity, given Taiwan's de facto secession and Tibet. More recently, Uyghur separatists have been increasingly framed as a threat.
And China has a strategy to deal with this.
A comprehensive fourfold strategy. First, massive economic investment to address inequalities. Second, large-scale population movement, often Han Chinese, to dilute local demographics. Third, an enhanced internal security presence, surveillance, detention camps.
Right, that's been in the news.
And fourth, a foreign policy cooperating closely with Central Asian states and Russia to suppress cross-border support. As many observers note, China and others have quite effectively used America's war on terror opportunistically to repress further any communities judged threatening, reframing internal dissent as global terror.
So the security threat label is key.
It's absolutely essential for both states and separatists. Struggles over territory sustain their identity narratives. For governments, it legitimates military operations and boosts investment in national identity through popular culture. As Barry Bazan pointed out, designating something a security threat is crucial politically because it automatically justifies coercive means, surveillance, force because the state's existence is supposedly imperiled.
Allowing exceptional measures.
Exactly. But these struggles also remind us national identities aren't static, they're constantly contested. Iraq today is a chilling reminder. Colonial borders and multiple identities coexist uneasily. Even a new flag means little without local legitimacy.
And other countries have used the war on terror narrative.
Strikingly so. Post 9/11, apparent allies like Russia in Chechnya and Israel in the Palestinian territories have opportunistically sought to rebrand their local struggles as part of a broader global narrative of counter-terror.
Linking local conflicts to a global war.
Precisely. It highlights how geographical scales, subnational, national, global, are intertwined and can be strategically manipulated. President Putin framed Russia's violent interventions in Chechnya, which started before 9/11, as a response to Islamic extremists threatening Russia's integrity.
But with unintended consequences.
Tragically, yes. The irony is that due to harsh tactics and civilian losses, Russian actions arguably fueled Islamic militancy, which then justified terror acts like the horrific Beslan school attack.
That's a sobering thought, how a state's response to internal challenges can inadvertently fuel the very extremism it aims to suppress. This brings us to a much broader canvas. How do we understand global identity on the biggest scale? Let's talk about Samuel Huntington and his provocative thesis on the clash of civilizations.
Samuel Huntington certainly created an intellectual earthquake in 1993 with his essay The Clash of Civilizations in Foreign Affairs.
It got a lot of attention.
Massive attention. Much like Fukuyama's End of History, its striking title and timing ensured huge publicity and intense debate. Huntington's argument was stark. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics. The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future.
A new map of the world, basically.
Essentially, yes, populated not by states, but by 7 or 8 distinct civilizations, each with its own cultural core. And critically, in Huntington's world, Islam was identified as the principal threat facing Western civilization.
Islam as a monolith.
He depicted it as largely monolithic, spanning the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia. His understanding was heavily informed by Bernard Lewis, a scholar who significantly shaped U.S. neoconservative thinking, arguably influencing the Bush administration's post-9/11 Middle East policy.
But this was heavily criticized by Edward Said, for instance.
Scathingly. Said the prominent Palestinian-American academic saw it as deeply problematic. He argued defining Islamic civilizations as inherently threatening was simplistic identity politics reminiscent of the Cold War.
Just swapping communism for Islam as the enemy.
That was Said's argument, replacing the Soviet Union with Islam as the convenient global threat, creating a false dichotomy serving political agendas.
Okay.
Said also highlighted extraordinary silences or omissions in Huntington's mapping.
Like what?
Well, for one, the idea the West is solely Christian ignores long-standing Jewish and Muslim communities integral to Western history. And it's incredibly hard to find any civilization not profoundly influenced by diverse flows, people, faiths, food, architecture. Think of Islamic influence in Spain and Portugal. It demonstrates exchange, not just conflict.
That's a powerful critique, suggesting that Huntington's thesis oversimplifies complex realities. It makes me wonder, what are the real-world consequences of simplifying identity into such broad, sweeping categories like a clash of civilizations? It seems to have a profound impact on how people interpret global events and even justify certain policy decisions.
Indeed. Edward Said, in his powerful 2001 article, chillingly titled The Clash of Ignorance, warned exactly that the idea could easily inform an American worldview interpreting events like 9/11 in purely cultural existential terms, ignoring geopolitical or historical grievances.
And the danger is?
The inherent danger in such simplistic labeling is it sacrifices interdependence and complexity for black and white, us versus them. In Bush's America, you saw influential right-wing commentators like Ann Coulter linking Christian Western superiority to policies defending Israel, or even extremely advocating destruction of the Islamic world. For some Christian evangelicals, it fed into beliefs about Armageddon.
But it ignores history, like colonialism.
Egregiously so, often. To truly understand today's tensions, you must appreciate the legacies of colonial dominance and resistance. The Huntington thesis tends to just represent other places as inherently threatening, without delving into how British and French colonial domination in the Middle East, artificial borders, exploitation shaped and continues to shape contemporary relations and grievances.
That history matters.
Immensely. British or French claims to moral superiority rang hollow when they bombed and massacred populations they controlled. Think of Egypt in the 1920s-30s, foreign soldiers, segregated spaces, like apartheid South Africa later. This collective humiliation fueled anti-colonial movements like the Muslim Brotherhood.
And individuals felt this too.
Yes. Egyptian radicals like Said Qutb visited the U.S. in the late 40s and reported deep dislike for its perceived materialism and racial discrimination. While contemporary Islamic militancy is complex, living memories of colonial occupation and dislike of the racist nature of Western liberal democratic states are undeniably significant parts of it.
And interference continued after independence.
Often, yes. Western powers used proxy regimes. Iranians still highlight the CIA sponsoring the 1953 coup against Mossadegh, replacing him with a pro-Western monarch, an act still fueling anti-Western sentiment.
That's a powerful and disturbing account of how historical grievances and the simplification of identity can create deep-seated resentment and conflict. So what does this all mean for why people, both in the West and elsewhere, might embrace these seemingly simplistic ideas despite their obvious flaws and the dangers they pose?
It's a crucial question because the clash of civilizations offers cultural and geographical simplicities that, frankly, just don't match our complex, interconnected world.
But they're appealing.
They can be. In an age of rapid change and uncertainty, such simplicities can provide a deeply comforting reading-listening experience. In some parts of the U.S., less engaged globally perhaps, it offers a digestible way to make sense of the shock of 9/11.
Like, they hate us because we're free.
Exactly. It provides geopolitical nourishment for a worldview that the U.S. is hated simply because it's successful and free, a victim of its own virtue, rather than a nation whose policies might generate grievances. It's a clear, though flawed, explanation.
And elsewhere, why might Muslims embrace it?
Conversely, for many Muslims experiencing marginalization or perceived injustice, the clash notion might resonate because it helps make sense of a daily reality of fear, uncertainty, and humiliation. For Palestinians, the daily roadblocks and checkpoints are tangible reminders of one community, often associated with the West, holding power over their lives and dignity. The clash narrative offers a framework.
And figures like bin Laden use this.
Explicitly, bin Laden and his associates presented their struggle as against Jews and crusaders using historically loaded language. In his manifestos, he consciously utilized the clash of civilizations to help explain and legitimate his campaign against the U.S. and its allies, including apostate regimes in the Middle East.
What was his goal?
His stated desire was a new, purified Islamic community, the Ummah, based on cultural religious purification of the Middle East, ejecting Israelis, apostates, and Americans. Political geographer John Agnew summarized bin Laden's view as seeing the U.S. as an earthly Satan locked in a death struggle with an infidel civilization. Only by expelling the West can the pollution be swept away. It shows how a simplified, powerful narrative, however flawed, becomes incredibly potent and dangerous when adopted by those seeking to justify conflict.
That's a truly unsettling and insightful explanation of how these grand narratives, however simplistic, can become powerful tools for both understanding and inciting conflict. Now let's try and unpack all these layers of identity we've explored throughout this deep dive. From the national to the pan-regional and down to the subnational, it's profoundly clear that identity politics fundamentally shapes geopolitical relationships.
It absolutely does. This deep dive has really aimed to shift our focus away from seeing geopolitics only through the lens of fixed geographical conditions or just the actions of great powers.
Right, moving beyond traditional geopolitics.
Instead, we've emphasized how a state's location, its very territory, is actually constructed and invested with significance through narratives of identity. Territory isn't inherently strategic. Its meaning is assigned by human stories, historical grievances, political narratives.
And geopolitics assigns value based on these narratives.
Exactly. Geopolitical reasoning plays a critical role in assigning values to some communities and territories, often at the expense of others. This becomes particularly poignant when a country seeks territorial redress for historical losses, like Argentina, or perceives itself facing an existential threat.
And this often leads to justifying force.
Frequently. These identity-driven dynamics frequently lead to the frequent justification of military force, actual or threatened, and aggressive doctrines like preemption. And crucially, these claims aren't just produced in government circles.
They're everywhere.
They are consistently reproduced within popular cultural arenas, such as newspapers, magazines, and cartoons, embedding them in public consciousness, making them seem natural. It creates this feedback loop where public opinion shapes and is shaped by geopolitical narratives.
That's a critical point about the narratives being reproduced in popular culture. It seems to suggest that despite the profound impacts of globalization and the interconnectedness of our world, borders and state territories still matter immensely in defining who we are. But at the same time, we're seeing the rise of multiple identities that transcend those very borders. Where does that leave us?
That's the key nuance I think we need to take away. On the one hand, state territories remain terrifically important in defining national identities. It would be a complete exaggeration to claim that globalization has eroded this connection.
So the nation-state isn't dead.
Far from it. Even with all the unprecedented flows of information, capital, people, the nation-state remains a powerfully resilient organizing principle for identity, offering a primary sense of belonging for billions.
But it's not the only connection.
And this is the critical addition. The state and associated national territory coexist with a host of other geographical corrections. These operate at various overlapping scales: subnational, like the Catalans; regional, like the EU's attempt at supranational identity; even civilizational, like Huntington's thesis.
So we have multiple layers of identity.
Exactly. The consequence of these complex permutations is that individuals and communities are far more likely to lay claim to multiple identities that cross over national boundaries and identities. You might identify strongly with your nation, but also with a region, a cultural heritage, a diaspora, a religion, a global cause. These layers don't erase each other. They create a richer, more complex, often more fluid tapestry of self-identification in our globalized world.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? We've explored how identity isn't static or singular. It's a dynamic geographical construct, deeply intertwined with power, conflict, and even the everyday routines of our lives. It's constructed, contested, and constantly evolving. As you go about your day, perhaps reflect on your own multiple identities. Your national identity, sure, but also any regional, subnational, or broader cultural or civilizational affiliations you feel. How might these various layers shape your understanding of the world, the news you consume, and the conflicts you observe globally?
And this raises, I think, an important closing question. In a world constantly bombarded with narratives about us versus them, often designed to simplify complex realities, how can understanding this constructed, multi-layered nature of identity actually help us navigate conflicts and maybe build more inclusive futures? Think about the media you consume, news, entertainment, and critically consider what identities they are trying to reinforce or perhaps challenge. Understanding that identities are fluid and multi-layered, not fixed and singular, gives us a powerful tool to deconstruct simplistic narratives and foster a more nuanced, maybe more empathetic understanding of global dynamics.
That's all for this deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this extensive exploration of geopolitics and identity. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.